420. Now I don't want to go into too much detail about those aspects because that's definitely a topic for another video, but in broad strokes, bit depth is basically how many colors you have per channel. The more bits, the more colors. And chroma subsampling is a method of reducing bandwidth by focusing more on luminance than on color. And the ratios, like 4 to 2 to 0, are detailing how much information was lost or combined during that process. Again, with this one, the higher the number the better, with 444 being the best. Now the interesting thing about H.264 is how it's used. In the beginning, I said that there were generally three intentions of a codec: acquisition, intermediary, and delivery. But if you look at an average consumer's workflow for distribution on the internet, H.264, often in an MP4 container, is used for all three. For example, I'm recording this on my GH5. Now internally, the GH5 could record this video, which is 4K at 24 frames per second, in an MP4 container using the H.264 codec, and it can do that at 10 bit, that's the color bit depth, and at 422 chroma subsampling. Now I could take that file and upload it straight to YouTube, and that would cover both the acquisition and the delivery in an H.264 MP4. And then YouTube would probably distribute it to your screens using H.264 as well. And if I wanted to edit that video before uploading, I would import those files into my editor, which is Premiere Pro, and keep it as an H.264 MP4. So that would make it my post-production codec as well. Now this doesn't exactly qualify as an intermediary because the codec isn't changing, but you get the idea. So it's pretty great that a codec can be so flexible and universal, but there are some serious drawbacks. First of all, that file I described, the 4K 10-bit 422 and an H.264 MP4, can be quite taxing on your computer to edit, so it doesn't make for the best post-production codec. And as an acquisition codec, it suffers from being in its lowest form from the get-go, with considerable data loss and compression. It is pretty great for web distribution, video streams, and RIPs intended for portability, but there are better performers in that area as well, they just aren't as well adopted yet. One of the most popular potential successors for this purpose would be the high-efficiency video codec HEVC, appropriately known as H.265. It's better for this kind of distribution because it can double the compression of H.264 but keep the same level of quality. So it gets smaller, but you don't lose anything. And you're starting to see HEVC show up as an acquisition codec in cameras these days too, with the latest GoPros offering H.265 to handle their higher resolutions. Now let's go back to the shortcomings of H.264 and build off of it by exploring some potential solutions. So we talked about how H.264 isn't the greatest for editing, and the first solution to this is actually included in many cameras, and it's called all-eye recording. Now this is another dense topic that I don't want to cover completely here, so I'm just going to speak generally about it. But the typical compression for H.264 uses something called IPB, or long GOP. GOP stands for group of pictures and refers to a sequence of frames which contain I, P, and B frames, hence IPB compression. Think of I frames or interframes as a complete picture. But in order to save space, the codec also uses predictive frames, P frames, and bipredictive frames, B frames, to only render out the portions of the image that have changed throughout the sequence, rather than redrawing the whole image each time. This makes editing harder, because in order to pull up a frame of your video, the computer has to read and decode the frames before and after it in order to compile a full sense of that picture. And if you cut the footage, the IPB sequence needs to be recalculated in order for it to maintain its integrity at the cut. And this can really bog down your edit. All I or all intra attempts to solve this by only using the intra-frame compression of I frames and not bridging the gap with predictive frames. This means when you pull up a frame in your editor, you only need to pull up that one frame and not the surrounding ones. And when you place a cut, no extra work needs to be done, and this can make for significantly smoother editing performance. Now, all I is just a compression technique, so it doesn't really help that much when it comes to acquisition quality. It's not going to change your bit depth or modify your subsampling, but it is more suitable for post-production and gets you closer to the performance of a dedicated intermediary codec. However, there are some serious limitations to all intra, and they mostly have to do with storage space. Eliminating those P and B frames means that the bitrate and file sizes go up significantly because there's much more data being recorded. And because all I is a solution built into cameras, it generally works off of the same card slots that we'd use for IPB compression or photos. This means you'll likely have to purchase faster cards to handle a higher bitrate and larger capacity cards to grant you the same recording time. And when it comes to SD cards, really fast cards with high capacities are not priced very affordably on a $1 per gigabyte scale, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. The other issue that some people encounter with all I is the read speed limitations of their hardware. A question I've been asked before is, why is all I performing slower on my machine than long GOP? I thought all I was supposed to edit smoothly. And in this case, often what it comes down to is hard drive speed. Older mechanical drives, especially those found in laptops, often can't feed the data fast enough to the editor for the all-I files like it could for the smaller IPB files, so in those cases, a faster solid-state drive is definitely required. Now I want to talk more about the intermediary intent of a codec. I mentioned that all-I can serve as a decent post-production codec, but there are others that do this much better, like ProRes and Avid DNX. When it comes to Avid, there's different codec groups. There's DNX HD, which stands for Digital Nonlinear Extensible High Definition. It is typically used for resolutions up to 1080p. And then there's DNX HR, Digital Nonlinear Extensible High Resolution, which is for resolutions above 1080p. These codecs are typically stored in the MXF container we were talking about earlier, but can also be stored in an MOV. When it comes to the HR variant, there are 5 distinct profiles, and these are kind of like the profiles we talked about with H.264, but they have the level component built in with predefined data rates. And the same is true for ProRes, which has 6 different versions, including a proxy variant. Now there's quite a few commonalities between DNX, HR, and ProRes. For example, they both use a minimum chroma subsampling of 422. They both use a intraframe compression method, so they're all I. They're both optimized for editing, and they both offer a range of different bit depths. When it comes down to choosing between the two, it's more important to look at compatibility than it is their specs. ProRes is an Apple codec, and thus is well tuned for use on a Mac, especially with Final Cut. Now ProRes will also work with other NLEs, but most PC users report better performance when using DNX-HR. Now another thing that these codecs are commonly used for is making proxies. Proxies are just what they sound like. They're basically video files that stand in place of the original file to make it easier to edit. If you're working with source footage that's just too demanding to edit, you can make a proxy of that footage using a lower quality or bandwidth and using a more edit-friendly codec like ProRes or DNX. Then when your project is complete, you export the video, but it applies your edits to the original footage and exports it from it rather than from the proxies, so you retain full quality. This makes sense as something that you would do with massive RAW files or uncompressed video that's just too difficult to work with, but a lot of people actually do this with their H.264 MP4s and use an intermediary codec like ProRes or DNX. The idea is that it's much easier to edit 1080p or 720p ProRes video than it is a 4K H.264. It's important to remember, however, that this does not improve quality, because remember what we said earlier, that one of the disadvantages of H.264 is that you're starting off already compressed at sort of like that lowest common denominator. So even though ProRes can have better subsampling or more colors, you're not going to get those just from converting your footage from H.264 to ProRes or DNX. You're still going to be locked in at whatever you recorded at with H.264. Now if you've been following up to this point, you might have concluded then that the best of both worlds would be to do your acquisition with a quality post-production codec like DNX or ProRes. And that's exactly what camera companies have concluded as well. These codecs may have started as intermediary formats, but they are becoming much more commonly offered as acquisition codecs. There are, however, some considerations to be made. ProRes and DNX take a lot more space and require much faster storage, faster and larger than most consumer cards can deal with at a reasonable price. To demonstrate this and give some more details about ProRes and DNX HR, let's do a small comparative case study with the Panasonic GH5. As I was saying earlier, this video was recorded in Ultra HD, which is 3840 by 2160 resolution, at 24 frames per second in 10-bit 422. If I use the standard long GOP compression, which is offered by the GH5 for H.264, it's going to need 150 megabits per second, which is 18.75 megabytes per second, because 8 bits in a byte, so you divide 150 by 8, and you get 18.75 megabytes per second, which means it's going to take about 64 gigabytes to record about an hour of video. And this is manageable because any V30 SD card will be able to handle that. By the way, if you want to know more about designations and speeds and stuff like that of SD cards, make sure you check out my video on that. But basically, V30 means it can do 30 megabytes per second with video. And that's higher than 18.75. So we're okay. Now if I change the compression from long GOP to all intra, the bitrate increases from 150 megabits per second up to 400 megabits per second, which is 50 megabytes per second. And this now exceeds a V30 card, and you start to enter into the V60 and V90 card territory, and into UHS-2 cards, which can cost up to 5 times as much. Also, the capacity of those cards will need to increase, because it now takes 180 gigabytes to get an hour of recording time, up from 64. Now let's look at a comparable ProRes version. ProRes 422HQ would probably be the highest quality available if our GH5 could record ProRes internally. It would take full advantage of the 10-bit color and the oversampled image and give us the most latitude for grading and effects. But ProRes 422HQ, when recording an Ultra HD image at 20